Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. 1 year ago, our leaders stood in front of cameras and promised that Palisades would be rebuilt safer, stronger, and better than ever. They promised results, they promised recovery, and they promised support. But 1 year later, we have to ask, did they deliver on these promises? Where are the people who lost their homes today? And should we feel so sure that this won't happen again? We're breaking it all down today. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you want more information or sources cited in compiling today's episode, then you should check out my corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. So, just last week on January 7th, it marked the 1 year anniversary of the absolutely devastating wildfires in Pacific Palisades and the Eaton fire in Altadena. If you remember, last year around this same time, we were watching these cities just absolutely and completely burn. As a reminder, 16,000 structures were destroyed by both fires and 31 people lost their lives. Now, directly after these fires, our leaders made a lot of promises. They promised recovery, and in that, they promised certain things to the victims of both of these fires. And so I think it's fair 1 year later to reflect on the progress that's been made, to ask the questions of where people are today and if our leaders have delivered on these promises. Because ultimately, we have to remember the people, the human impact, the people who are affected, who lost their homes, who have been displaced, and who are still living in this nightmare because of the result of bad government policy. We should be honest about what our leaders are promising, we should be honest about what they're delivering, and we should be honest about if they are staying true to their word. So that's what we are going to do today. Promise number one, what we heard directly in the aftermath of these fires from leaders like Governor Gavin Newsom, as well as LA Mayor Karen Bass, was that they would cut the red tape and that they would fast track rebuilding. Let's listen to a clip of Gavin Newsom saying just that.
With an executive order I just announced and passed today, waiving CEQA, Coastal Act issues, and having a mindset to move local government to get permits done for projects within 30 days, all around recovery and rebuilding this community.
So we see that Governor Newsom jumped right in. He was on the scene. He went and toured the different places that were impacted, and he made promises like in this clip and many other videos, as well as press conferences, that he was doing everything possible to cut the red tape and to make sure that people would be able to rebuild their homes. Now, part of the problem, just off of the bat, is the idea that there is so much red tape in California that already the prospect of rebuilding just felt so daunting. That speaks in itself to our housing market, it speaks to our development market. But setting that aside, I do want to acknowledge that Governor Newsom did sign many executive orders, especially in the early months of 2025, that were aimed to do just that. He cut down on CEQA regulations, which we've talked about on the show before, as well as other acts like the Coastal Act. And a lot of those require certain permitting, they require certain building materials, whatnot. And so that can actually slow down the process. And so the idea or the promise was that by signing these executive orders, that it would move things along very quickly, that homeowners would be able to get permits to rebuild their homes. And so the process would not drag on for years and years. However, it is important to note that executive orders don't fix the root causes of the issue, and they don't fix the regulatory burden that we already see in our state when it comes to things like housing development. And so executive orders can often signal urgency, and that's what these did. It signaled a sense of urgency that this is what Gavin Newsom wanted state agencies to prioritize, and he wanted to show the Californian people that it was top of mind and that he would do what he could to roll back certain regulations. Unfortunately, though, there are a few things that executive orders can't really do, or at least the ones that he signed couldn't really do in California. It couldn't rewrite local zoning laws. So really, when it comes to housing and development, a lot of things are not only dictated from a state level, but also from a local government level. And here in Los Angeles, unfortunately, there are a lot of regulations and there is a lot of requirements around zoning. Additionally, it couldn't override local permitting. So while it could speed along some of the processes, it could not force certain, again, local city agencies in order to just approve thousands of permits just because Governor Newsom said so. And so a lot of residents had to still go through the same permit process. And additionally, it didn't add any staff or capacity just automatically. It didn't just wave a wand and all of a sudden there are a bunch of people who now work for these agencies to come in and approve these permits quickly so that residents could get back to rebuilding. And so we run into the same bottlenecks that existed before the fire, but now they're made worse by just the sheer volume of people who are trying to go through this process. So where is progress today? 1 year later, with our leaders saying that they would do all of these things, that they would make it really easy for homeowners, I would imagine that many homes would have been rebuilt, that many permits would have been approved, and that we would start moving forward. That, unfortunately, is not the case. As of January of this year, under 12 homes have been rebuilt. I just want us to stop and think about that for a second. 16,000 structures total were destroyed. And I think of those 16,000, it's around 9 or 10,000 that were actually homes. And so of those 9,000 homes that were destroyed, under a dozen have been rebuilt. That's wild. I can't fathom how there are so few homes that have actually been reconstructed for people to move into. That means that of those 9 to 16,000 people who have lost structures in order to live in or work in, that only under 12 of them have been able to move back in. Does that sound like we've really fast-tracked any sort of process? I mean, we've had a year and under 12 have been built. I would hope that in California, we could build more than 12 homes per year. We see developers do it. So what is happening? What are the bottlenecks holding everything up for recovery in these areas that were destroyed? And so you might be thinking, well, under 12 were actually built, but surely there are a lot that are under construction. And so maybe things just haven't been finished. Well, currently only 900 homes are under construction. And if you compare that to the total structures damaged, that's only around 17%. So if you extrapolated that evenly out, that would take several more years just to get all of the homes rebuilt that were destroyed. Additionally, when we look at things like permitting, that's something that was really big, right? He's cutting red tape. He's saying that permits will be approved. LA City has received more than 3,000 applications for permits in order to rebuild, and yet under half of them have actually gone through the process and been approved. So that means that over 1,500 people are still waiting on getting their permits approved to start the process. And so from these results, we see that the process truly has not changed substantially enough to allow for people to rebuild their homes quickly. This is going to be a multi-year long process. And unfortunately, many homeowners are just giving up. They're walking away. They are selling their lot. They're saying, I don't even want to be involved in this because it is going to take too much time, too much money. And honestly, it's just too emotionally damaging. If I can just move on and walk away and start over, I would rather do that than try to fight the city of LA and the state of California in trying to rebuild the home that I once had. That might not even be protected because, as we're going to talk about later, a lot of the things that led to the fires really haven't substantially changed either. This is the result of regulatory burden on housing and development here in California. This is why it's important when we talk about policy, when we talk about new laws that are being passed, when we say that there are going to be more environmental regulations around building, when we say there are going to be new laws around affordable housing, about zoning, about what houses can be built where. This is a tangible example of why it matters, because laws stack on top of each other to create this complex web and maze of regulations so that when something happens like a fire or a flood or some type of destruction and there is mass loss, it feels absolutely impossible to rebuild because now you are reaping the results of how difficult it is to build in California in the first place. Even in ideal conditions, California takes 10 to 18 months longer on average to build a home. And these clearly are not ideal conditions. There is a lot that has to happen with hazardous waste. There's a lot that had to happen with just cleaning up all of the debris that happened after the fires. So obviously this isn't ideal. So how much longer then will it take in California just to rebuild your home? This is why policy matters. Every single law, no matter how small it seems or how niche it seems or how it seems to not really affect your life directly, every single law matters because they all add up to make lives more difficult for people when situations like this occur. So, Promise 1, we see that they said they would cut the red tape, but the tape is still very much intact, and unfortunately, it is standing directly between families being able to get back into their homes. Promise number 2 that was made by our government leaders was a more personal one. It was one that said, not only will we help to fast track rebuilding, but residents will be supported and they will not be left on their own. Mayor Karen Bass specifically made a lot of these claims. She was saying that there would be clear guidance on the steps that were going to happen next, that there would be support for taking those next steps, that there would be coordination among agencies to really streamline the process so that homeowners wouldn't have to work with a bunch of different agencies in California just to figure out what's going on. And that, of course, there would be help with things like insurance, with rebuilding, with temporary housing, all the things that now residents were having to run into. But 1 year later, again, if we listen to actual fire victims and the residents of these areas in California, they would say that they felt completely stranded and alone. And just as one story that's not even the most devastating story, take the story of Miriam Engel. She had a home in Pacific Palisades, and her home was actually left partially standing, but because of the fires and the fire damage, it was completely uninhabitable, not to mention the fact that her entire community was just gone in a matter of days. She reported that she still had to pay property taxes on the completely charred lot that she owned, and that she still had to pay on her mortgage because her house was left standing. And so she just felt like she could not catch a break even after all that she had endured, and the fact that she couldn't even live in the home that she now had to pay for. And she knew so many of the residents who were going through the exact same situations. She said, quote, "We were failed at every level, local, state, and federal." Does it sound like she felt supported, seen, heard, and actually helped through this entire process? Or does it sound like she just was experiencing, again, burden on top of burden, property taxes on a lot that wasn't even usable for her, payments on a mortgage that she clearly could not even afford because she had just lost everything? And really the key frustration among victims like Miriam was this lack of coordination between the different departments and different agencies, even though they were being promised that it would be an easy process and that their concerns and their worries and their questions would be heard and answered. And so what we saw was that victims had to become their own advocates. They had to essentially be their own case managers for figuring out what they needed to do, who they needed to talk to, what needed to get approved, what they needed to fill out, how they needed to go about their insurance claims. And so they had to coordinate among the city department, state agencies, utilities, insurers, contractors, lenders. So it's all of a sudden this promise of support didn't really feel real to the people who were living it. And the number one complaint that is coming out from these victims is really all centering around insurance. A lot of fire victims are saying that they are not getting payouts that are high enough to help them cover the cost of rebuilding. And so even if they start to go through the process of trying to permit in order to rebuild, they run into the fact that they cannot afford the cost to be able to rebuild their home, especially as the prices of construction continued to rise in the aftermath. Now, I want to focus on this because it is really easy with insurance to just blame insurance companies. And I think that it would be easy for our politicians to do that as well. And so we see that of calling on insurance companies of, have a heart, these people have lost everything. How could you be so cheap? You're just trying to make a profit. You're trying to keep from covering for these people's unfortunate incidents and everything that they had lost in these fires. But this is not primarily an insurance company problem. This is a policy problem. And this is something that I covered last year directly in the aftermath of these fires. And so if you want more information on California's insurance policies and the insurance crisis, please go check out that episode of my podcast because it was incredibly informative as to what is going on and why insurers were going at the time, we're going to have a hard time paying out these claims. But now a year later, we can look back and we can see that a lot of that is true. The problem is that California's regulatory framework has made it incredibly difficult for insurance companies to accurately be able to forecast for the level of risk in insuring certain people who live in higher areas of risk, like close to wildfires here in California. And so historically, companies have not been able to adjust their rates very quickly. And so that has led insurance companies feeling like they're not able to, again, forecast accurately for what they're going to have to pay in the incident of an event like this. And if they can't do that, then they start to pull out of the market, because if they feel like the state is working against them and that they are not able to actually make sure that they will be able to pay a lot of the claims that come their way, then obviously they're not going to want to operate. There's no incentive for them to continue operating. And so we saw a very large shift of insurance companies out of California, specifically between 2021 and 2024, right before this very unfortunate fire broke out. As private insurers moved out of the state, then homeowners were left with fewer options. They had fewer options for what insurance company they wanted to go to, because there was less insurers in the market to begin with. That drove up prices because there's more demand and there's lower supply. Basic economics once again comes in handy here. And so because of that, if you're a homeowner who lived in a high-risk area for fire, if you tried to get fire insurance, it either was super expensive or you couldn't find an insurer who would cover you because you had too high of risk that they just didn't feel like they could mitigate here in California. So what did we do? Well, that led to a lot of reliance on something called the FAIR Plan. California's FAIR Plan is its insurer of last resort. So in California, we have a certain plan that is state mandated, but it's privately funded. And so the state mandates that insurance companies all essentially contribute into this pool of funds that then goes toward insuring certain people who have too high of risk in order to be able to get insurance coverage from a private insurer, or who can't afford the private insurance that they are being offered. Here's the problem. An insurer of last resort only exists to provide very basic coverage. It is not comprehensive coverage. It is going to have very high deductibles. It's going to have low payouts and higher premiums as well. And so really people need to be getting private insurance first. They need to be able to have options in the marketplace to choose from. And the FAIR Plan should definitely be a very, very, very last resort in instances where you are trying to figure out what you're going to do. And it really shouldn't be a long-term solution. But again, as insurers moved out, people had less options. And so the amount of people who relied on the FAIR Plan doubled. It more than doubled in recent years. And so all of a sudden you had a lot of homeowners in high-risk areas dependent on this state-mandated program. So what we're seeing after the fires is that thousands of people are dependent on this one program in order to fully fund their claims for the loss of their homes. And there's just not enough money. There's not enough coverage. And unfortunately, the policies that they had through this plan are just not comprehensive enough to actually pay for them to be able to rebuild their homes. And so people are incredibly frustrated and they feel very disenfranchised by the insurance company. But ultimately, it all ties back to bad policy. Because if you are going to make your insurance policies, if you're going to have so many laws in your state, like California does, around what insurance companies are allowed to do, and you're going to make them so stringent that insurance companies do not feel like they have any incentive to operate here, then you are going to drive them out and you are going to leave people completely dependent to pool their risk together into one plan where there is no diversification. And so then ultimately they cannot be covered in the event of a catastrophe. So really what we're seeing is that California promised that people would be supported, but it created the very environment for these problems to be compounded. And it took what was supposed to be a safety net and it instead turned it into a substitute for a fully functioning insurance market. And so that has just resulted in what we're seeing today of residents feeling completely unsupported through this whole process of rebuilding. And it's a direct result, once again, of bad government policy. The last promise that we were told by our government leaders in the aftermath of these fires was that we will rebuild stronger and safer. It was a completely forward-looking promise that said that this tragedy truly would be a turning point, that things would change here in California, and that we would not allow this to happen again. And so what would this look like? Well, really what it looked like was better vegetation management, right? wildfire prevention strategies. And so things like clearing brush, actually shoring up infrastructure so that it could withstand certain degrees of wildfires, as well as coordinated emergency response, because that was a huge thing that we saw last year with the fires, was just very slow response times and very slow abilities for fire departments to accurately respond or adequately respond to such large-scale fires. However, if we look at where we are today, it seems that we are not in any better of a position than we were last January. So the first big piece is just wildfire prevention and vegetation management. But unfortunately, that is a huge battle between prevention as well as environmentalism. So in 2025, in the past year, California Republicans actually put forward the lion's share of policy, of legislation that was meant to move forward wildfire prevention. They said, we don't want another repeat of Palisades and Eaton, and so we want to pass better laws that will actually help to prevent wildfires in the future. What happened, though, is that a lot of these proposals include trying to roll back some of the CEQA environmental regulations so that vegetation management can happen faster and more effectively. Basically saying, there are certain policies and laws in place that make it so that we can't cut down a certain amount of vegetation, or it has to be done in a certain way. Let's roll those back so that we can clear a lot of the brush, so that we can do controlled burns, and so that we're ready for the next fire season. And we've actually done something to change things here. But environmentalists do not want to cut these regulations because they want to protect trees. They want to protect wildlife. They want to protect the environment. And so they have pit them at odds against each other and have held up a lot of this legislation. And so, like I said, we're really still in the same position that we were last January. Additionally, critical infrastructure problems still remain. And the number one problem here really is our power grid. If you think of our power grid, it is aging. It is a huge fire risk. I don't know about you, but every summer I get days or even weeks at a time where our power company alerts us that there are certain times of the day when they're going to be shutting off the power. And they do that because when there is extreme heat, they are afraid that their power lines could spark and lead to a wildfire, and then they would be liable for that. So they just stop the power altogether. The problem is this is a Band-Aid fix. This doesn't actually fix the problem that says that your power lines are aging so much and they are so frail that they could just fall, that they could be blown over by the Santa Ana winds, that they could spark in the first place and cause an electrical fire, and that could turn into something like wildfire. It doesn't address the root causes. It just says, we're just going to shut off power to everybody, which is very inconvenient and very annoying when it does happen. Ultimately, aging power lines made up 10% of the wildfires between 2016 and 2020. 10% of those wildfires were caused by these electrical power incidents. And then we saw in 2022 that extreme heat was causing the power lines across California to sag, and we saw wildfires spark from that as well. And so when it comes to things like infrastructure, we need complete overhaul. We don't just need these Band-Aid. We're going to turn off the power for a few days and hold our breath and really hope that nothing goes wrong. Because ultimately, it doesn't even have to be extreme heat. It could just be like in January when we see extreme winds, and that could be enough to spark some sort of fire. And so, like we see with vegetation management, with infrastructure, really not much has changed. And then, of course, for the icing on the cake, the insurance drama just continues. So from 2021 to 2024, California's 12 largest homeowners insurance companies fled the state. They either completely rolled back coverage or they just left the state entirely and just removed their business from us. Now, in 2025, Governor Newsom was claiming that companies were returning. And he specifically said that 5 companies had returned to California and that was a result of some policy changes that he had made. Here's the problem. The 5 companies he listed were not included in the list of companies who had actually left California. So those largest insurance providers are still gone and are not looking to return anytime soon. And that's creating the entire insurance problem that I just talked about the fact that there are just not enough insurers here to actually provide comprehensive coverage, as well as to give competition in the marketplace to drive prices down so that people can afford it. So we see with all of that we are not actually addressing problems. We're just spinning narratives. We're just going out and saying, oh, people are returning to the market, or, oh, we are going to do wildfire prevention. We're really going to make sure that we build back stronger. And then a year passes and nothing is different. And we're having massive winds and we have periods of heat and everyone starts to hold their breath wondering when the next fire is going to strike. So as we come to the end of it, looking at these promises, I want to just address quickly, as we do with every single topic, why does this matter? Why do we care? And there are two main reasons that came to my mind when wanting to talk about this topic. The first is that this has real human impact. Your fellow Californians have been impacted. You may know someone personally who is impacted by either the Palisades or Eaton fires, and we see that this has been devastating. Families are still not able to get into their homes. It pushes people out of California because they just have a general mistrust of how things are able to be handled here, or it moves people out of the communities that they were a part of because it completely destroyed their communities. If we really care about our fellow neighbor, if we really care about the people who are most vulnerable, the people who have lost their homes, then we should demand that when our government makes a promise, when our governor makes a promise to you and to people who have been affected, that they should have to deliver on that promise. Gavin Newsom does not get to say that he made a promise and he delivered and he executed and things are going so well here in California. And then you turn around and there are people who are not able to rebuild their homes because of the zoning laws that have been encouraged and passed by our state. That is just not acceptable. Bad policies have negative impact on real people. And maybe the fire didn't impact you, but it could. It could the next time. And unfortunately, bad policies all across our state in a variety of topics are affecting your life and can affect your life going forward in the future. And so we have to care about that. We have to care about the human impact. And we have to make sure that even if our leaders say that they care, that the outcomes actually match what they're saying. And that leads me to point 2, which is the fact that this is an election year. There is a midterm. There are going to be candidates up for governor, as well as many other offices across the state, including mayor of Los Angeles. And we need to, more than ever, hold our leaders accountable for the actions that they have taken. When I said last week that you can't judge a policy by its intention, but by its outcome, I think that also directly applies in this scenario, that you cannot judge what our leaders say by if they are well-meaning. You have to actually judge what they do afterwards, what the outcome of their promises are. And unfortunately, the outcomes that we're seeing with Palisades are not what has been promised to the people. And so we're left to question, are they lying or are they just bad at their jobs? Either way, we need to vote them out of office. Trust must be earned. And our leaders in California have definitely not earned our trust. And so when it comes time for an election, we need to really evaluate our choices and we need to make change. So ultimately, anniversaries are not about just remembering what happened. They're also about measuring if what our leaders promised that they said that they would do were actually delivered upon. And unfortunately, when we look at Palisades and we look at Altadena, we see that this does not look like a success story. This looks like an instance where our government leaders told us to trust them, and yet once again, they failed us. And so as we head into this election year, we as voters must ask ourselves, if this is how these government leaders deliver on the promises that they make, then why should we believe what these same leaders are saying that they will do in the next year? Ultimately, we can't, and it's time for accountability. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state and that you even learned something new. If you love this show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.